In a Senate chamber charged with tension, silence fell as Angus King leaned forward and delivered 3 words Pete Hegseth never expected. "Shut up, Pete." The words didn't echo because they didn't need to. They landed like a gavel on marble, sharp enough to slice through the air. Cameras caught every angle, Hegseth's jaw tightening, King's calm but fiery stare, the restless shifting of staffers and senators caught in the storm. It wasn't just a command. It was a statement of authority, of exhaustion with noise masquerading as debate. The room itself seemed to contract. The polished wood desks, the muted red carpet, the solemn flags draped at the front. All of it was suddenly backdrop to a confrontation that no one had scripted, yet everyone would remember. Reporters froze mid-keystroke, their fingers hovering above keyboards. Photographers leaned in. The hum of whispered side conversations died instantly. It was as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. And then came the looks. Senators. Raising eyebrows, aides hiding grins, a ripple of disbelief flickering across faces. Some looked appalled, others thrilled, but all of them knew they had just witnessed the kind of political collision that breaks through the noise and ricochets. Far beyond those walls, Pete Hegseth, the polished Fox News personality, had walked into the chamber armed with his usual bravado, but in that single moment, the script flipped. For Hegseth's audience, defiance is the brand. Interrupt, provoke, dominate. That's the style. But in Washington's oldest debating hall, that arsenal suddenly looked flimsy. Against the weight of an independent senator with decades of experience, those weapons collapsed. King's voice wasn't louder, it was steadier, and that steadiness cut deeper than any shouted talking point ever could. Shockwaves weren't just felt in the chamber. They were visible in real time. Phones lifted, texts flew, live tweets burst into the digital ether. This was more than an exchange. It was a rupture, the spectacle of arrogance colliding with restraint, of bluster slamming. Head first into calm authority, and yet, even in that electric silence, there was an unspoken promise. What unfolded in those few seconds wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Because this wasn't just a clash of words, it was the unraveling of an entire persona. Pete Hegseth hadn't come to the Senate chamber to listen. He came to perform. The Fox News host, whose career thrives on heated exchanges and combative monologues, arrived at the hearing table with the energy of a man who believed the cameras were there for him. His words weren't measured. They were sharpened, crafted, less as questions and more as provocations. Every sentence seemed aimed at generating a viral clip, a soundbite to play again that night for a primetime audience conditioned to cheer defiance. He leaned in often, cutting off speakers mid-thought, his voice pitched to carry over anyone daring enough to continue. It wasn't the first time Hegseth brought television theatrics into the halls of government, but it was one of the rare times those theatrics faced genuine resistance. And on this day, Angus King, seasoned, deliberate, the embodiment of calm. New England reason had no intention of letting the noise win. For those watching, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side sat a man who made his career by inflaming division, stoking fear, and pushing the boundaries of respect to gain attention. On the other sat a senator known for his ability to bridge divides, to listen before he spoke, and to command respect without raising his voice. It was a live-action parable unfolding in front of a nation exhausted by chaos. This was not simply about 2 men in a room. It was about what kind of dialogue America was willing to accept. Would the chamber be reduced to another cable news shoutfest, dominated by talking points designed for clicks and outrage? Or would it hold the line as a place where dignity, truth, and reason still had power? That question hovered over every interruption, every raised eyebrow, every exchange between Hegseth and King. What made it electric was the stakes beyond the chamber. Millions were watching, not just in real time, but in anticipation of how this clash would be clipped, spun, and shared across the fragmented media landscape. Hegseth's allies would frame him as fearless, challenging the establishment. His critics would see a man out of his depth, crumbling when confronted by a voice of integrity, and in that collision of narratives, the truth of the moment would either cut through or be drowned out by noise. But in that chamber, with history's weight pressing down from portraits of leaders who came before, Angus King made a decision. He would not let arrogance dominate the story. The lines between journalism and spectacle had blurred. The distinction between reasoned debate and televised chaos was at risk of disappearing. This was bigger than Pete Hegseth. This was about whether America still had patience for substance over spectacle, for calm authority over reckless volume. Each interruption raised the temperature, each dismissal frayed patience. Viewers could feel it building, the way a storm gathers on the horizon. Dark clouds, quickening winds, the air thick with inevitability. And in the thick of it, Hegseth smiled, convinced his antics were working. He was producing the drama he came to produce. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't the director of this script. He was its foil. Because when dignity finally collided with arrogance, when truth decided it had heard enough from noise, the explosion was inevitable. And when tensions rose, no one imagined it would explode this way. Pete Hegseth is not a man unfamiliar with the spotlight. To his audience, he is a soldier-turned-TV host, a man who wears patriotism on his sleeve and delivers commentary with the swagger of someone convinced he's the last defender of American values. On Fox News, his fiery rhetoric plays like a drumbeat, loud, forceful, and relentless. He doesn't merely discuss issues, he declares them as if the fate of the nation hangs on his every word. For years, this combative presence has been his brand. He thrives on confrontation, on cutting through nuance with sound bites sharp enough to sting and short enough to trend. But beneath the performance, contradictions run deep. Hegseth positions himself as a truth-teller, yet he often traffics in exaggerations designed less to inform and more to inflame. He champions himself as a man of the people, but his stage is built on corporate media's glitz and millions in airtime. He decries political elites while dining among them, mocks media bias while wielding it as his weapon. To admirers, these contradictions are irrelevant. They see only defiance. To critics, they expose him as a provocateur, a man whose allegiance is not to dialogue but to spectacle. In Senate chambers, that persona becomes even starker. Unlike the cable studio where he dominates every frame, here he must share space with those who've built careers on lawmaking, negotiation, and careful persuasion. Yet Hegseth carries into these rooms the same posture he brings to television: interrupt first, speak louder, dominate at all costs. His voice rises not because the argument demands it, but because the cameras reward it. Moments of grandstanding define his trajectory. On air, he has tossed softball questions to political allies while scorching opponents with derision. He has turned panel discussions into battlegrounds where shouting matches masquerade as analysis. Each time, his strategy is clear: overwhelm the conversation until substance suffocates under the weight of his performance. For Hegseth, conflict isn't a hazard of dialogue, it's the product he's selling. That approach may work under studio lights where producers can cut, frame, and polish. But in the raw, unedited world of congressional debate, the cracks begin to show. Here, arrogance isn't rewarded with applause, it's confronted with scrutiny. And scrutiny is a stage Hegseth has never been comfortable standing on for too long. To progressives, immigrants, and those tired of demagoguery, Hegseth represents something larger than himself. He embodies the voice that talks over them at dinner tables, the pundit who dismisses their struggles as distractions, the figure who thrives on reducing complex human stories into one-liners that win claps from a studio audience. He is, to them, not a voice of truth but of dismissal, an amplifier of division masquerading as a patriot. And yet, what makes him dangerous is also what makes him brittle. His confidence is absolute until tested. His swagger seems impenetrable until it collides with someone unwilling to play his game. His dominance depends on silence from others, and when silence breaks, so does the illusion. Inside that chamber, Pete Hegseth leaned on the same tactics that had worked for him countless times before. He interrupted with a smirk, waved dismissively when challenged, and filled pauses with his voice rather than reflection. Every gesture carried the assumption that his performance would cow the room, that the senator across from him would shrink under the pressure of his volume. But this time, the arena wasn't built for him. This wasn't a studio where producers would reward chaos. This was the United States Senate, where silence is sometimes more powerful than speech, and where dignity is a force that cannot be shouted down. The irony was palpable. The very qualities that had propelled Hegseth to celebrity, the bravado, the bombast, the refusal to concede, were the same qualities that now painted him as out of place, even absurd. His strength became his weakness, his style became his liability, and as he leaned forward with that familiar grin, convinced the room was his stage, he failed to see what millions watching would recognize instantly. Arrogance was writing his downfall in real time, because arrogance always meets its match, and Pete's was waiting across the table. Angus King's journey into American politics was never scripted by party machines or fueled by the culture of sound bites. He didn't rise from the trenches of partisan warfare, nor did he build his career by appealing to the extremes. Instead, he walked a different path, one rooted in independence, pragmatism, and a belief that leadership is about solving problems. Rather than creating headlines, born in Virginia but making Maine his home, King forged his reputation not as a firebrand but as a bridge builder. His career spanned law, business, and teaching before politics even entered the picture, giving him a depth of perspective that set him apart from those who spent their entire lives maneuvering within the Beltway. When he eventually sought public office, he did so not as a Republican or a Democrat, but as an independent, a declaration that his loyalty belonged first to the people, not to party bosses. That independence became his calling card, while Washington sharpened itself into red, and blue corners, Angus King walked the aisle between them. He was not flashy, he did not dominate the news cycle, but in committee rooms, in policy discussions, in debates that required more thought than bluster, his voice carried weight. Respected across party lines, King became known for something rare in modern politics: consistency of character. Colleagues noted his calm presence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't grandstand. He didn't weaponize rhetoric for applause. Instead, he listened, really listened, before speaking. When he did speak, he spoke with clarity, measured cadence, and a gravity that made people lean in rather than recoil. In an era when politics often rewarded the loudest voice, King proved that quiet authority could still command a room. His debates were lessons in patience. While others rushed to score points, King took his time, dissecting arguments with logic, rather than volume. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it was because the issue demanded it, not because the cameras were rolling. That discipline made him formidable. He wasn't swayed by theatrics. He wasn't rattled by noise. Where others sought to win moments, King sought to win trust. The people of Maine, fiercely independent themselves, found in King a reflection of their own values, plain-spoken, practical, unwilling to be boxed in by partisan labels. They sent him first to the governor's office and later to the United States Senate, trusting him to represent not an ideology, but a spirit of reason. In every role, he carried that responsibility with a sense of duty that resonated far beyond state lines. Against chaos, King's style could appear almost understated. He didn't need to dominate a conversation because his presence itself carried authority. He didn't match fire with fire because he understood that flame dies when deprived of oxygen. His approach was one of dignity, not weakness, but strength born of discipline. In this way, he stood as a counterpoint to the rising tide of political performers who treated governance as theater. And yet, this calm was not passivity. King's quiet demeanor often masked a sharpness, a readiness to cut through noise with precision. When arrogance crossed a line, when disrespect threatened the integrity of dialogue, he had the capacity to strike, not with fury, but with finality. He was not a man easily provoked, but once pushed too far, his words could land like hammers. This balance, restraint paired with resolve, made him uniquely equipped for the clash that would unfold with Pete Hegseth. On one side, a man whose career thrived on constant interruption, on dominating the space with volume and provocation. On the other, a senator who had built his reputation on listening, waiting, and speaking with deliberation only when it mattered. Most, it was not just a personal contrast, it was symbolic of a larger divide in American life. Hegseth represented the culture of endless noise, where winning meant trending and where disruption was rewarded over dialogue. King represented a tradition older than viral clips, the belief that leadership is measured by restraint, by dignity, by the ability to command respect without demanding it. For progressives, for immigrants, for those who see their struggles dismissed. Nightly, by the loudest voices on television, Angus King embodied something they longed to see more of: a leader unwilling to be drowned out by arrogance, yet unwilling to become arrogant himself. His calm became a beacon, a reminder that truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. And so, as Pete Hegseth leaned in with his smirk, armed with interruptions and sharpened talking points, he believed he was about to control the room. What he didn't know was that Angus King had been forged precisely for moments like this. His calm was not a weakness. It was the weapon that would undo Hegseth's performance. And when that chaos tried to dominate the room, King's calm would become his weapon. The exchange began with the kind of confidence only Pete Hegseth could summon. He leaned forward, his voice slicing into the air before the senator had even finished a sentence. "With all due respect, Senator, you're dodging the point," he declared, his tone carrying more accusation than inquiry. His words weren't a question. They were a challenge, sharpened to provoke. Angus King did not flinch. He folded his hands, waiting, letting Hegseth burn through his opening volley. Years in public service had taught him the value of patience, and patience now became his shield. But Pete wasn't interested in patience. He pressed again, louder this time, the rhythm of his speech quick and insistent, like a man determined to drown out anything that might threaten his narrative. The room shifted uneasily. Staffers glanced at one another, sensing the temperature rise. Other senators sat straighter in their chairs, their eyes darting back and forth between the combatants. Hegseth, emboldened by the silence, mistook restraint for weakness. "The American people are tired of politicians who won't give straight answers," he barked, cutting off King mid-breath. The irony, of course, was lost on him, that in his rush to dominate, he was the one preventing any answer from being heard. King finally leaned forward, his voice calm, deliberate. "If you'll allow me to respond." His words were measured, his cadence steady, the very opposite of Hegseth's firestorm delivery. For a moment it seemed the chamber might settle, but Pete wasn't ready to relinquish the floor. He interrupted again, his volume rising with each interjection, his tone brimming with disdain. He jabbed the air with his finger, as if punctuating the interruptions with exclamation points. The dynamic was unmistakable. One man trying to bulldoze the conversation with noise, the other refusing to be dragged into the mud. King's responses, though brief, carried weight. Each time he managed to speak, he offered clarity, facts, and reason. Each time he was cut off, the contrast sharpened. Viewers could see it unfolding, the arrogance of performance clashing against the discipline of substance. As the interruptions stacked, the tension thickened. The chamber, normally governed by decorum, had transformed into a theater of frustration. Hegseth's voice thundered, filling the room, while King's silence became heavier, more purposeful. The senator's eyes fixed on his opponent, unblinking. As if silently measuring how far this would go, it was a duel of opposites. Hegseth, restless and loud, thrived on escalation. King, immovable and steady, embodied resistance without spectacle. But every interruption was a test of patience, and even patience has its limits. Those watching could feel it building, the sense that the air itself was charged, that something was about to break. Pete leaned back for a moment, smirking, as if convinced he had already won. "See, Senator, this is why people don't trust Washington. You can't even give us the truth without hiding behind excuses." The words hung heavy, an insult not just to King, but to the institution itself. King inhaled slowly. He had listened. He had waited. He had endured the noise long enough. And now, with every camera trained on him, with millions already leaning in closer to their screens, his resolve solidified. The chamber fell quiet in anticipation. Reporters poised their pens. Viewers at home could almost feel the pause, that moment before lightning cracks the sky, and then with the nation watching, the senator finally snapped. The room had been teetering on the edge of chaos for minutes. Pete Hegseth's voice filled every corner of the chamber, an avalanche of interruptions, accusations, and barbed remarks. He was certain he had the upper hand, certain that his noise would smother any attempt at reason. But then Angus King leaned forward. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the distance between himself and the microphone. His lips parted, his voice steady but firm, and 3 words shattered the air like a thunderclap. "Shut up, Pete." It was not shouted, it was not barked. It was delivered with the calm finality of a man who had exhausted patience and chosen authority. And that calmness made it hit even harder. The effect was instantaneous. The chamber froze. For the first time since the exchange had begun, Pete Hegseth's voice fell silent. Gasps rippled across the room. A few aides shifted in their seats, trying to hide their reactions behind clenched jaws and tight lips. Senators glanced at one another, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Even the journalists in the press gallery paused mid-sentence, their fingers hovering over keyboards as if unsure whether to type or simply take in the moment. The silence was deafening, thicker, heavier than any shouting match could ever create. Pete's face told the story better than words. His mouth hung open just long enough to betray shock before he attempted to reset his expression into something resembling composure. But it was too late. The cameras had already caught that flicker of disbelief, the instant where arrogance collapsed into vulnerability. His eyes darted across the room, searching for support, for someone, anyone, to jump to his defense. None came. Angus King did not lean back immediately. He stayed forward, his eyes locked on Hegseth, his presence radiating the kind of authority that cannot be manufactured. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged, filled with the weight of years spent in public service, the gravitas of someone who had weathered storms bigger than a television pundit's tantrum. The pause stretched, and with every passing second it was Pete, not Angus, who grew smaller. A stifled laugh broke from somewhere in the back, quickly muffled but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone unable to hold back the absurdity of watching the unshakable Pete Hegseth reduced to silence by 3 words. Another aide glanced down, biting the inside of their cheek, desperate to keep composure. The chamber was on the verge of breaking into something it rarely saw: human, unscripted reaction. The cameras panned across the room, catching the subtleties, the tight smiles, the widened eyes, the suppressed grins. These were not outbursts of mockery, they were acknowledgments of a moment everyone knew was bigger than the personalities involved. It wasn't just King telling Hegseth to stop, it was a collective sigh, a cathartic release for those tired of arrogance drowning out substance. Pete tried to recover. He cleared his throat, shifted in his chair, and forced a smirk back onto his face. Well, Senator, I think the American people deserve better than politicians who can't handle tough questions. His voice was still firm, but the edge was gone. The rhythm had faltered. The bravado sounded forced, strained. He was no longer leading the exchange. He was scrambling to salvage it. King leaned back slowly, finally giving the room a chance to breathe. But his eyes never wavered. His calm never broke. When he spoke again, his tone was measured, steady, unmistakably in control. The American people deserve respect, he said evenly, and respect begins with listening. The words landed like another strike, quieter than the first, but no less powerful. It was a lesson, not a lecture, a reminder that dialogue is not domination and debate is not a contest of volume. In that instant, King had reframed the entire exchange, turning what had been a shouting match into a teachable moment. Pete opened, his mouth again, but it didn't matter. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Every interruption now sounded weaker, every attempt at bravado rang hollow. The chamber had seen the mask slip, and no amount of bluster could put it back in place. Reporters scribbled furiously, already crafting the headlines. Clips were time-stamped, marked, prepared to be broadcast across social media within minutes. "Shut up, Pete" would not remain confined to the Senate walls. It was destined to become a viral refrain, shorthand for a larger frustration with voices that mistake volume for value. Meanwhile, those inside the room sat in the aftershock. Some marveled at the simplicity of it. 3 words, spoken without theatrics, had done what hours of argument never could. Others reflected on the symbolism, how one calm voice had cut through the fog of arrogance and reminded everyone that power isn't always loud, but it is always clear. Pete's attempts to push forward grew more desperate. He raised his voice, gestured wildly, tried to regain the tempo, but the spell had already been cast. Every eye in the chamber now lingered on King, the man who had taken control not by outshouting his opponent, but by silencing him. The authority was his, and no amount of noise could reclaim it. The exchange ended not with a bang, but with a stillness that carried its own resonance. King spoke his final words in that segment calmly, without gloating, without excess. He didn't need to embellish. The power of the moment was self-sustaining. Pete, on the other hand, sat diminished, his usual arsenal of quips and interruptions neutralized, and as the gavel moved the hearing forward, the chamber remained charged. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare, the precise moment. When arrogance was punctured, when bluster collapsed under the weight of dignity. For Pete Hegseth, it was a humiliation. For Angus King, it was vindication. And for the country watching, it was a reminder of the kind of leadership that still mattered. The air settled, but the silence lingered like an echo. Outside, beyond. The chamber walls, millions were about to replay the moment, dissect it, and share it. But inside, in those first seconds after, it was clear. The tide had turned. Because in the end, the nation hadn't just seen a man silenced. They had seen arrogance defeated by calm authority, and the shockwaves of that moment were only beginning to spread. When the chamber finally resumed its rhythm, the exchange between Pete Hegseth and Angus King lingered like a shadow in the room. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It had become something larger, something symbolic. And as the nation replayed the clip, shared it across screens, and dissected its meaning, a truth began to crystallize. This was not about one man telling another to be quiet. It was about the values that define leadership and the difference between noise and dignity. Angus King's words, though brief, carried a weight that far outlasted the moment itself. "Shut up, Pete," wasn't a lapse in decorum. It was a defense of it. It was a reminder that leadership is not measured in decibels, but in discipline, not in how forcefully one dominates the conversation, but in how steadily one holds the line of reason. King had reframed the chaos not with a tirade, but with restraint. In doing so, he elevated the exchange from petty squabble to timeless principle. Because what Americans saw in that moment was more than just a senator silencing a pundit. They saw the clash of two philosophies. On one side, arrogance, spectacle, and the belief that volume equals victory. On the other, composure, humility, and the conviction that truth requires no theatrics. And it was the latter that stood victorious. The lesson was clear. Dignity triumphs over noise. Calm steadies the storm of chaos. Truth endures when arrogance burns itself out. These are not abstractions. They are the foundations of leadership, the very qualities people yearn for in an age of endless shouting and performative outrage. For viewers, it wasn't difficult to connect the dots beyond that chamber. How many times have communities been drowned out by those who mistake bluster for strength? How many moments of genuine dialogue have been hijacked by arrogance disguised as confidence? And yet, time and again, it is the calm, the steady, the principled voices that history remembers. King's calm became a mirror in which Americans could see themselves, their frustrations, their hopes, their longing for leadership that reflects decency rather than division. It wasn't about partisanship. It was about something deeper. The American spirit that believes dignity is not weakness, that listening is not surrender, that respect is not optional. The emotional resonance was undeniable. Across social media, the refrain took root. Sometimes, the strongest voice is the one that knows when to silence arrogance. It spread not as a slogan, but as a moral affirmation. For immigrants who have endured being talked over, for citizens who have felt unheard, for young people searching for examples of integrity in public life, this moment was validation. It was proof that even in a climate saturated with chaos, dignity can still win, and it mattered that it was Angus King delivering the rebuke. Not a firebrand, not someone known for theatrics, but a steady, independent voice who rarely raised his tone. That made the line hit even harder. Because when someone like King speaks sharply, you know it's not impulse, it's necessity. His calm was not weakness, it was a weapon. Leadership, at its best, inspires more than loyalty. It inspires reflection. King's moment forced Americans to ask, what kind of voices do we want shaping our future? The loudest? Or the wisest? The brash? Or the dignified? His example suggested the answer was not only clear, but urgent. And in the days that followed, as the clip circulated and the reactions poured in, it became more than a viral exchange. It became a parable, a reminder that in the battle between arrogance and dignity, it is dignity that endures. That arrogance may win a headline, but dignity wins history. Because in the end, leadership is not about silencing opposition. It is about silencing arrogance long enough for truth to be heard, and that is what Angus King accomplished in that chamber. He showed a nation weary of shouting that calm is not silence, that restraint is not weakness, and that truth, when spoken, with dignity still carries the power to humble even the loudest voices, and that more than any soundbite is why this moment will be remembered, not as an insult but as an affirmation. A reminder that America's strength has never been in the noise, but in the quiet courage of those who choose dignity over arrogance, calm over chaos, and truth over spectacle. Pete Hegseth's breakdown was never just about him. It wasn't. Only a television host losing his composure in the presence of a steady senator. It was about something larger, about what happens when arrogance finally collides with dignity, when the bluster of noise is met with the strength of calm. That moment in the chamber told a story every American instinctively understands. Noise is temporary, but truth endures. Spectacle fades, but dignity leaves a mark. And when Angus King leaned forward and delivered those 3 unforgettable words, it wasn't an act of spite, it was an act of clarity, a reminder that even in an age of endless shouting, there are still leaders willing to hold the line of respect and reason, because this was never really about shutting down a man, it was about shutting down a style of politics that feeds on division, chaos, and arrogance. And it's about lifting up a different kind of leadership, one rooted in patience, principle, and courage. So if you believe that these voices deserve to be heard louder, if you believe that dignity should stand taller than division, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a movement that amplifies calm over chaos, truth over noise, and integrity over arrogance. Because in the end, history does not remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood with dignity, and when the books are written and the reels replayed, moments like this will echo far louder than any outburst, because history remembers the calm, not the chaos.